Hello and welcome to the Decatur Dish. My name is Dan Whisenhunt, editor and publisher of Decaturish.com. Our guest today is journalist and documentary filmmaker King Williams. King, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Dan. How are you?
Can't complain. So, by way of explanation for our viewers, we are actually live on location in DeKalb County today, not by choice. Today's episode Chaos is brought to you by Public Education in Atlanta and all the schools being closed because it's cold and we don't want to send kids to school in the cold now, do we? So this is the Decatur Dish show. We do an episode every Tuesday at 12:30 on Atlanta News First Plus. We are a local website based in DeKalb County, Georgia. We cover Decatur, Avondale Estates, Kirkwood, Eastlake, Tucker, Clarkston, Stone Mountain, and a lot of other areas. So that's us, and that's what we're about. King, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about what you do and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I am a journalist and a documentary filmmaker. I also have a newsletter where I do explainer expository journalism, where I explain complicated and sometimes not complicated things for the everyday person. I do a lot of work in the Metro Atlanta area. I'm also a contributor at times to Decaturish, a wonderful website that you must also visit. And just a lot of the work I do is about local news, local stories, and making sure that we have a lot of local voices on the ground talking about things that you may or may not know in the Atlanta area.
King, and how can they subscribe to your Substack real quick? Because people really should.
Yeah, it's called I Am King Williams. So I am King Williams dot Substack. That's SUBSTACK.com.
Definitely a good read. Definitely check that out. So I want to start by talking about what gave me the idea for this episode. And if you don't follow King Williams on Twitter, you should because it's one of the best things that's still on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now. And he had a long Twitter thread about third places, third spaces in DeKalb County, the South DeKalb County, or the lack thereof. So, what are third places, third spaces? What is that?
Yeah, so third places or third spaces, the words are interchangeable, but they mean the same thing. This is about this notion of where you go to for choice. So this is not something that you need to stay at, which is like a primary residence, which is your first space, or your secondary place that you need to go to for either education, instruction, or income. So this excludes the second space, which is your school, where you go for work, and also for those who are in the military service. These are places that are required for you to be at for some type of function to happen. And then the third space is the spaces that you choose to be at for either leisurely activities, activities related to friendship, business, personal business, friendships, and all the things in between. So it's the place that you consider where you go. This is different from, say, a transactional space like a grocery store, which is some people consider maybe the fourth space, because that's a place you need to go to, or some people also consider it a second space, again, in the urban planning field. We're still not too settled on what those things should be places you go to for either retail related issues, but right now, the third space is the space that you choose, and that can be a variety of things from your bars, your pubs, your public parks, public walkways, sometimes just hanging out, outside of a venue for a long time. And so you see a lot of different uses for third spaces. Barbershops could be a good place so that these are places where people choose to congregate for the sake of congregating, meeting other people, or sometimes for themselves. That's just not at home and not at the workplace.
So coffee shops, right? That's another
Hmm.
good example. So I'm in
Yes.
central DeKalb County. I could throw a rock and hit a coffee shop. I've got one. I've got Corner Cup up the street. I've got Waller's down the street. I can walk to both. I got Refuge Coffee in Clarkston. I can walk to that as well. What is in South DeKalb? What are the third places that are in South DeKalb right now?
Right now, there's not many, unfortunately. So when we talk about coffee shops, that's probably the most well-known. Coffee shops have existed in Europe since the 1600s. It's a place for that very reason, for people to meet and to kind of congregate. But in South DeKalb, there's not many third spaces, unfortunately. Right now, we see a lot of people using makeshift spaces. So again, barbershops are one thing you see that kind of emerges in third spaces. Sometimes churches, depending on where they're located and what their function is to the broader community, that could be one. But there's really not a lot. And so sometimes you see people just congregating outside of gas stations or local convenience stores. I think a good indication is going up and down Candler Road and Flash Hills Parkway and just seeing the number of people who can't congregate anywhere outside of maybe a fast food restaurant or a gas station just to meet up and talk with their friends, or just to meet up and converse with people.
And what is the driver of that in South DeKalb? Why are there so few third places, and why isn't that something that people are investing in?
Well, a lot of it has to do with just the design of it, right? So this is one of the few cases. DeKalb is no different from a lot of places throughout America, especially from the 1950s to the 1980s. We really pushed the suburbanization design, and now we've seen a lot of the limitations on that. And so for South DeKalb in particular, a lot of the design and a lot of the economic development is still based around the car, and more specifically based around the suburban notion of you drive to what you want and and where you leave. And so when you have that transactional model, what you do in your normal environment, even meeting people, talking to people, just comes secondary. You can see that with our lack of sidewalks throughout the place, our lack of parks that are easily connected to spaces. And then also in terms of third spaces, the number of businesses like a coffee shop or even just a restaurant people can sit down at, or a co-working space, just are non-existent because of design, and the real estate brokers who own most of the strip malls, which are also a holdover of suburbanization, don't prioritize it. So you kind of get what you get.
So what's the solution? Is it just for somebody to be the hero and come in and make the investment? Are there policy choices we need to make? What do we need to do to turn that around?
Yeah, so the great thing about this is anybody can effectively do it, right? So South DeKalb has some pretty lax zoning on a lot of things. And also, this is something you really don't need policy for, right? And so, third spaces in particular, what you really do need is just like oftentimes, because there's so many suburban style strip malls, is you just need one strip mall owner to open up that space for a coffee shop, or one open up that space for your co-working space. Just open up those particular places where people are already kind of going for these transactional expenditures, to also say, hey, you can also sit here, you can also be in this place as well. The other one is on the policy choice, if we want to, is really how do we incentivize people to take small investments? So a coffee shop is expensive, but it's not expensive to say building a new strip mall. So what policies are we doing to kind of grow small businesses? Because a lot of times these third spaces are a byproduct of small businesses. So coffee shops, your local bar, your local co-working space, these are all small businesses. And so if we're thinking about a policy, what policies could you be doing to actually grow these smaller businesses that cater to these communities?
So we have elections coming up in DeKalb County. I found out the other day that we are going to have 6 races related to county commission on the ballot, which is just mind blowing. And we're going to have the CEO race as well. As we're nudging our policymakers in a direction to get them thinking about these types of issues, what do you think would be a good question to ask these candidates about this topic and their approach to this topic?
Ooh, okay. So I would ask first for the CEO is what would you be doing to incentivize third space growth throughout South DeKalb County? And so what I would ask specifically is there's a couple nodes in South DeKalb where third spaces could start immediately, like by the end of this conversation. So these are in places like your old corridor, so you're like your old Lathonias, or places near Stone Mountain, and also places near Arabian Mountain. So places that already have like at least a built-in foot pattern, but built-in traffic, but they have no development whatsoever, a lot of vacancies. So what would be a strategy to make these places all third spaces, because those are places that are already kind of built for that type of environment to be at. The other one is for all the county commissioners is what are you doing to grow smaller businesses and smaller footprint businesses within your districts? And so a lot of times, two things they could be doing, which is ending parking requirements for a lot of these businesses to exist. And I think the most important thing is just abolishing a parking minimums altogether. And so what that means is oftentimes if I want to open up, say, King's Corner Cup of Coffee, I might have the money to actually buy the building, to renovate the building and such, but I then need to spend an extra $200,000 to build out 50, 60 parking spaces. And so if you're trying to incentivize small business growth, actually that's one of the things each one of the county commissioners could do, is just to abolish those little things. The other one is allowing for homes and residents that are on main roads or main arteries to also be zoned for mixed use. And what that means is, let's say, again, we're going to use Candler Road as an example. There are a lot of homes that sit directly on Candler Road. A lot of those are still, they have to either be directly related as a business or registered as a business or as a residential home. And I think making it more flexible to allow that any person could turn that into a business or into a home without going through a lot of the paperwork to do so and the up cost to do so would also help bring in more third spaces, because on Candler Road we have about 50 or 60 buildings between Memorial Drive and Candler, all the way up to Flat Shows, that really could be incentivized for these small business activations, but the cost to do so and the restrictions to do so through zoning really makes it prohibitive to even have those type of third spaces.
Candidates, I hope you're paying attention and taking notes. A lot of good information here. I wanted to switch gears a minute, and talk about this concept. And I had not. This is not really shocking because I don't hear about a lot of things until I see it on your Twitter. Because
Oh
I'm not
no.
I'm not exactly hip or with it these days. Being a middle-aged dad, but flop era. Now, when I think of a flop, I think of like a movie that fails or a Broadway show that fails. I don't think of it in terms of like a whole era that has flopped. But apparently, there you were posing a very intriguing question about Atlanta, which is Atlanta in its flop era? So let's explain that concept. What is a flop era for those of us who aren't in the know about what that means?
I'm just so excited that this has actually made the discourse of real news. So flop eras is just it's a colloquial term that's really come up through Gen Z speak a lot about. It refers to usually it started out referring to like music artists. So if you're in the hip hop world, that same phrase would be called the fall off. So you hear about rappers who fall off or they have a fall off period. But flop era was usually used by TikTok Gen Z pop stars who would talk about, hey, let's talk about the fall off. I was instead of the flop era of such and such, right? And so that became more of a broader statement that people started saying, "Oh, this is in its flop era. This is happening in its flop era." And so I thought about it a lot with Atlanta, both the city, um, in terms of what it kind of is as you live in the city, but also its reputation nationally. That a lot of times it seems like maybe we are in our flop era, meaning that the reputation is taking a couple dings nationally, right? You do a social media search of what Atlanta is, and I think everyone should do this when the show is over. Just see the first couple things that pop up when you do a geo search of Atlanta. You do a hashtag search, you do a basic name search of Atlanta, right? Then you can add the Atlanta restaurants, Atlanta food, Atlanta, party, Atlanta nightlife, Atlanta fun. Like you could just see like it's a tinge of negativity throughout all of them, and it doesn't take much to get through it, right? And so you look on these platforms, you see what people are producing content about, and I get it, that is one sample size. And so then I looked at some of like the news pieces that are being produced, and it's really taken a ding on the reputation of a city that's for the last couple decades has had a really stellar reputation. And so, um, with a lot of other factors we can get into if you want to, but it seems like right now
Oh,
Atlanta's
I
just kind of
do.
going
No,
through a
I,
swap
I
era.
I
Okay.
have I have so many thoughts about this. So let's give me an example of whatever the opposite of a flop era is for Atlanta. I'm thinking maybe the Olympics. Might be one. What's kind of a good counterpoint to that, so viewers can have two ideas to compare here.
Yeah, so right now we're gonna say the Atlanta flop era, and specifically right now from 2020 through 2024, right? Uh,
Okay.
and we're gonna compare that with say, let's say 92 to 96, to your point, right? Where the national attention, the national recognition on both local broadcasts and print papers about Atlanta was all up and coming. This is this great city. How did this southern city get the Olympics? What they're doing to prepare for the Olympics? And then the Olympic game comes, and just the level of people who actually really love the 96 Olympics in terms of its fan index and people who watch it broadly are really and genuinely, truly loved by a lot of people, right? You can even go a little further, like let's say 96 is too far away. I say also look at that period of Atlanta from 2000 to say 2008 or 2009, when you see like this, a couple of things. One, the rise of hip hop, also the rise of a lot of like media starting to come into Atlanta. So this is really like that generation 1.0 of the Atlanta film industry that's coming. R&B is taking a new thing, and then you also see this generation of people who are also coming up in Atlanta right now, especially like high school students, college students who are really, for the first time, really promoting Atlanta as a brand on a national level with like the advent of the internet and also the advent of television, just the level of media response to that. So we do have a lot of
I,
those.
I, I just want to pause for a second. There's something rubbing on the mic, so I wanted to mention it. It's coming across.
Okay,
There we go.
I can see it. Okay,
Yep,
I don't know what to do with my hands with you, Bobby. Um, so I won't.
it's
I'm
okay.
sorry, y'all. I talk with my hands. I'm gonna
Me
clip
too.
them here.
Same
So
curse.
yeah, so yeah, so I think that's what it is. And the thing I think that's interesting about this Atlanta flop era is that a lot of the negativity is coming from people who already live in Atlanta or people who have moved to Atlanta in the last few years and really have this perception based on like what the things we said before, people who learned about it through the 96 Olympics, people who learned about it through like their media consumption of hip hop and R&B, people who also in that social media 1.0 2.0 era really who had become fans of Atlanta from what they saw on social. We're talking like early Instagram 1.0 days, early Facebook days, just all the things that were coming out. and people really got involved with that. There's even a broader history, like there's just a secondary history of Black people's relationships to Atlanta, which dates back to the end of the Civil War and has multiple eras in which they are moving to Atlanta for a very specific reason. You also have like the colleges and universities here, from everything from Georgia Tech to Emory to Agnes Scott to Georgia State. There are students here who really, really loved and really do love Atlanta once they moved to Atlanta, and they typically didn't want to leave. Right? I think the last couple of years, with a couple, especially the case of universities, just the way they've kind of upped the price on everything. Right? In the case of Georgia State, like their dorms aren't next to the campus, and it's a little disjointed. And Georgia Tech is going through its own kind of pricing issues and just changes in general. There has been a bit of like, okay, you know what, this isn't as great as I thought. And so you kind of see that more and more come up as like a general everyday topic.
Yeah, it's you're posing a really interesting question. It's a lot of food for thought. Now, I'm a journalist and I think Atlanta's great, but that might be for all the wrong reasons. Because
No.
there's, you know what I mean? There's a lot of news, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of things to be talked about. You and I were kind of going point by point, and you said something about the sports teams regressing a little bit, and I have to push back on that some because Georgia's doing pretty well still. I know they didn't beat Alabama in the championship roll tide, but they're still they're still doing pretty well. They're favored next year I think to win the East. The Braves are still in playoff contention every year. The Falcons have historically not been great, so I don't know that that's a regression. The Hawks again, sort of the same thing. But what are some make your case? Like we talked about affordability, we talked about sports. What other indicators? What other flop indicators are we looking at on the flop metric?
Okay, so when it comes to sports, there's a couple of things. One, Atlanta's this thing where we can either get one team doing really well and none of the teams doing really well, or like all the teams doing really well and the one that people really like not doing well. It's like a bifurcation. We never have them all going at one point, and that's normal. But I think the flop era in sports in particular is like, let's bring up UGA in this case. This is a team where on paper they should have won every single game that they played this year. Then they lose the game that they shouldn't, with a team that probably shouldn't have been in the playoff in the first place.
Ooh,
Right? Listen, you're down
we
by
gotta have a
Auburn.
whole different episode about that.
Okay, okay, we'll have that episode. All right, and so then they're out of the championship. Then they beat Florida State, who decides to send in their scrimmage squad by 30. Right, so it looks a little weird. Right, so it's a little bit of a 60. I'm sorry. Like it just was very much like a deflating of the ball because this is a team that you knew probably could have won a championship. And you just see what happened. Like you lost at the worst possible thing. And as an Atlanta sports fan, that is the UGA experience. I know for a lot of us, we thought that we had been past this in the Kirby Smart era, but no, this is who we are as people, right? We get to the point where it really matters and then we fail. The same with the Braves. Oh yeah, they're great regular season. We get to that point where it really matters to win games and then we lose them, right? So like we're starting to regress back to who we actually are. The Hawks exist, right? Like they exist for like wintertime, like shelter. And the Falcons are about to hire a guy in Bill Belichick who, let's be honest, like yes, he's won 6 Super Bowls, but I think the record without Brady is starting to show up a little bit more. That one person has probably had a lot more impact on this relationship than the other one has now with the last four or
Right.
5 years without Brady being there. And so we're going to spend a lot of money on this, right? Like if we're going to spend that much money on a coach retiring, at least give us Nick Saban, right? I want some proven results, but this is what we do. We're going to spend a lot of money on a new coach in Atlanta that's probably going to get us 8 and 9 again, right? The Hawks are going to determine to be the most middest team of possible. And like that's just what we are. UGA is going to lose in the college football national playoffs. I swear to God, it's going to be like Dion in Colorado or something. We're going to lose when it actually matters the most, and that's just who we are, right? We're kind of regressing in sports to who we are. And I know for a lot of people who came in the last couple of years, like that doesn't seem like it, but I'm like, this is what happens. Like we're going backwards. We're going to that space.
Well, Atlanta sports teams, I believe in you. Dan believes in you. I don't know if that counts for much. So we got a few minutes left on our show. I wanted to talk real quick about the Keith Lee thing. So for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know who Keith Lee was, frankly, that not that that matters. But Keith is big on this. What do you call it? The TikTok, and he does food reviews. And doing my due diligence and research, I really like this kid. I think he's a real down to earth genuine guy who does a really good job of uh, talking about food experiences for ordinary people. and he came in, and we had the Michelin Guide, and there was a lot of hullabaloo about that. And then Keith Lee comes in, and it almost just pushed the Michelin Guide thing completely out of the window. And he said, "Okay, well, let's talk about the places where people really eat." And it blew up. Why do you think that there was such a strong reaction to Keith Lee's restaurant reviews? I'm fascinated by this.
All right, so for everyone at home, Keith Lee is a MMA fighter who's currently on a pause. MMA fighter, family man, m- you know, TikTok influencer in the food space. And so what he does is he typically goes to different cities around the country. He only eats at mom and pop shops, and most importantly, he only goes based on the number of recommendations that he's given. Right. So when he came to Atlanta, he had 10,000 people say go to Milk and Honey. He had 20,000 people say go to this restaurant. So he has a list of restaurants he goes to based on recommendations, and then also ones that are just mom and pop ones that he knows a lot of people don't go to. These are typically places that people reach out to. He goes there. He also does fundraisers through his TikTok account, and through the app Cash App and Venmo. So like if there was one recently in San Francisco, he was just there where the owner, unfortunately, the son had taken over after the father had died, and they, instead of just going to do a food review, he, I think, raised $40,000 to keep that business afloat. And so a lot of the time it's just about food, right? For him, he talks about like food was his comfort thing. And so he wants other people to have that same kind of comfort. And a lot of people put their time and effort into growing their businesses. And so when he comes to Atlanta, unfortunately, Atlanta really, Keith Lee was already a viral superstar. He didn't need any help being viral. He was already big on TikTok. Atlanta actually
Unfortunately,
made it.
Atlanta's in his flop era, and he didn't know that we were in our flop era when he showed up.
Well, we
So
know now. He definitely knows now. He actually came for one music fest, which is one of the few remaining music fests in the actual city of Atlanta. I think Music Midtown's the other one that really brings in a decent, and the Atlanta Jazz Festival that brings in a real crowd. Um, and so when he was here in Atlanta, we are doing our flop era. The number of recommendations he had was this thing for these things called grass wall restaurants. These are restaurants that are trendy. They typically have grass walls and neon signs and $50, drinks and fish bowls, right? And so he went to a lot of them, and they were all equally bad for different reasons. And then he also went to a lot of mom and pops, and they were all equally good for the reasons that the grass wall restaurants weren't. But the virality of him going to each and every restaurant really pushed Keith Lee from a superstar on TikTok from like a couple million followers to somebody who's now approaching 20 million followers on TikTok. And his videos now, I think, saw well over a couple 100 million views within TikTok and then outside of the platform as well. And it's just because this thing of Atlanta, right? There's certain people who really, really hate Atlanta because we're in our flop era and all the things like the grass wall restaurants represent. And having somebody like Keith Lee who's coming down to Atlanta with good intentions to eat good food is a wake up call for a lot of those restaurants. So much so that a lot of those restaurants actually legitimately had to have a restaurateurs meeting after he left to talk about the reputation that the Keith Lee tour had brought to a lot of the Atlanta food scene. For perspective, the Keith Lee restaurant effect has drawn more people to Atlanta restaurants than anything in the Michelin Guide, anything in Eater Atlanta that has been published all of 2023, and that's just like a impacted like the virality and where the puck is on social media and
and we're going to have
influence.
to stick a pin in that. That is a fascinating discussion. King, I hope that you can join us again. Hopefully, we can have you in studio next time when the public education system decides to let kids be in school when it's cold. This is the Decatur Dish Show. Sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 just
Nope.
go dogs.
King Williams, wonderful journalist, wonderful follow on Twitter. Definitely check him out. I am King Williams. Google that. You'll find him. This is the Decatur Dish Show. We will be here every Tuesday at 12:30. You can check us out at Decaturish.com. Go to locallysourcednews.com to get our newsletter. Go to supportyourlocalnews.com to become a subscriber. And a great way to help Decaturish is to download the Atlanta News First app. It's a great way to get old episodes of this show, get all the great content from our media partners at Atlanta News First, and supporting Atlanta News First is definitely a great way to support us at Decaturish. Again, this is the Decatur Dish Show. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again next Tuesday. Bye-bye, everybody.